Hello, everybody. Welcome to the It Hurts to Mom podcast. I'm Lauren Rose, and today we're talking about how drinking too much affects our parenting. Our guest is Duncan Bhaskaran Brown. Duncan drink wine, cider, brandy, what have you got? After 20 years of wanton excess, he cleaned up his act and trained with the world's most successful stop smoking clinic, which wasn't enough. He studied at Cornell University, the Chartered Management Institute, and a windowless room in Peterborough, which wasn't enough. He wrote a couple of books, including Real Men Quit, The Armchair Macho Guide to Beating Booze, which wasn't enough. He's interviewed sober superstars and conducted research projects which involved watching TV, which wasn't enough. What would be enough? Imagine if alcohol-free was the default, if sober was normal, and if alcohol stops destroying people. Maybe then Duncan would grab a mint tea and a sci-fi novel and relax. Maybe. Thank you for coming on.
That's fine. I'm looking forward to having a chat. I think it's a really interesting area.
So do I. That, like I told you before we started, I never would have thought to have this topic on my podcast, but I think it's going to be fascinating to talk about. And as we're going to get into, a lot of people with chronic pain drink, and I know a lot of parents drink, a lot of people drink. So I think it's a relatable topic. So you've told us a little bit about yourself and your bio, but tell us a story of how and why and when you started drinking. Like, were you a parent then? What was going on?
Oh, no. I started drinking. I was a child.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. No, my parents wrongly believed that if they gave me small amounts of alcohol, I would learn to drink responsibly. I actually, now being a bit more familiar with the research, what you've done is you've sensitized my brain to it. But um, I mostly started drinking like a lot of people, kind of teenage years, and I was. I was a little bit anxious when I was a teenager. I think a lot of us are. We haven't quite found our place in the world. I struggled quite a bit at school. I found it very difficult to sort of find a way to validate myself. I found it difficult to be successful at school. It always felt like whatever I did, if I tried hard, I got a bad grade. And if I didn't try hard, I still got a bad grade. So I just, yeah, I learned that lesson pretty quickly. Don't bother trying. And it just, I didn't have a way of sort of fitting in and getting some sort of success and feeling like I was moving forwards and things like that. So that led to me being a little bit nervous, a little bit anxious, particularly in social situations. So when alcohol came along, I thought all my Christmases had come at once. I thought, this is amazing. This stuff is really, really helping me. But as time went on, I started drinking more, but I started drinking with less people. So
Yeah.
the amount of sociability went down and the amount of alcohol went up.
That's interesting. How did alcohol affect you personally?
So it's almost impossible to really answer that question in the length of this podcast. I mean, the actual effects that alcohol has on people are so tremendous and persuasive. It's literally pick a part of your body and it will affect it. So, the low lights for me, I suppose, was I managed to give myself gout, which I think is quite an achievement, actually. And you used to have to be an aristocrat. You used to have to be king to get gout. It was the disease of the rich. So the fact that I managed to give it to myself is pretty impressive. That's a sign of my high living. But it also hurts. It's quite uncomfortable, so it was quite nice to get rid of that. I think the biggest benefit that I felt when I stopped drinking was the time, because I totally wasn't expecting it. I mean, if you'd asked me, I would have said, "Oh, I don't spend very much time drinking. I only drink in the evenings." And I was the typical high functioner. I had the platinum card and everything. And I was working very hard. I'd get up, I'd work all day. I was very involved in my community, go to a lot of meetings, deal with the emails. And once all of that was done, 9 o'clock, I'd have something to drink. So I didn't think that it was taking up a lot of time. But once I stopped drinking, I seemed to have a lot more time. And I started to realize that actually, if you drink between 9 o'clock and midnight every night, that's 21 hours a week, which is pretty much an entire
Wow.
day, including the bit you're asleep. So yeah, I mean, for me, the biggest drain, I suppose, was on my time. When I stopped drinking, I just had all of this wonderful expanse of time, and I have never suffered from boredom. So I managed to fill it with some really interesting stuff.
So you've got a child. Were you drinking as a parent, and how did that go?
No, I mean, things that does interest me is how much sobriety is connected to parenthood. I think partly that's to do with the fact that people take that step in life and they are forced to confront their priorities. They are
Mm.
forced to confront what they really want, and that was absolutely how it was for me. My wife and I were trying to have kids, and that was kind of fun. And we well, it was kind of fun until she had a miscarriage, and then it really wasn't very much fun. And I mean, obviously, that was very hard for her, and I wasn't there for her. I wasn't the husband or the partner or the friend that she needed at that time. I mean, the only real way I knew how to deal with stress was by drinking. So I just disappeared into the bottle, which is absolutely the worst thing to do at a time like that. So I our relationship was very, very strained at that point. And it's not, like, I'd love to tell you that, 4 a.m., staring into the mirror, I had this blinding realization, but unfortunately, life doesn't really work like that. I mean, looking back at it now, I can see that, there was a couple of months where I spent a lot of time working out what I wanted from life. I never posed it quite as dramatically, but there was definitely a question somewhere in the back of my mind, what do I want from life? Do I want another drink, or do I want to start a family? And I picked the right one, and our daughter was born almost 9 months to the day after I stopped drinking. So they were not lying about that fertility thing, were they?
Wow, that's amazing. I was wondering what was it that kind of got you started on sobriety. So I think that's really interesting that you made that choice, because that's a hard choice if you've been living your life. Do you think this is a question I think only an individual can answer, but do you think that it was an addiction problem, like your brain's is wired for addiction, or was it just a bad habit?
I mean, that is such a fascinating question, and another one I could fill the entire podcast with. So what I often say to people is, are you addicted to alcohol? Does it really matter? Because genuinely, what is the difference between being addicted to something and doing it every day? Functionally, there isn't really much of a difference. I personally see it as a developmental problem. So what I did was I taught myself to drink. I taught myself that the appropriate reaction to stress was alcohol. And I cemented that belief, that set of behaviors. I created a whole load of neural pathways along
Yeah.
which that behavior smoothly flowed to the point that it almost became automatic. But most of the drinking that I did, I didn't even really think about it. Um, so I mean, there are various different ways of categorizing it, but I use the Diagnostics and Statistic Manual of Mental Health version 5, their criteria for substance dependence. I use those quite a lot in my work. And looking back on my own experience, I would certainly be classified as having a severe substance dependence issue. So yeah, I mean, I think it it went well beyond the realms of just bad behavior, and definitely went into something like a medical problem. That said, I did not go to rehab. I did not have any medical interventions. I found a way to stop drinking that pretty much without any support.
So what was it that because you did all these other things to try to stop and they didn't work? What was it that finally got you sober?
So, funnily enough, it's kind of connected up with some other changes that I made in my life. Before I stopped drinking, I stopped smoking. And I used Alan Carr's Easy Way to Stop Smoking, which is a very popular book. There are also centers throughout the US and throughout the UK, throughout the world, actually. I think they're in over 50 countries these days.
Wow.
And it's a very, very successful method. And I few years after I'd stopped smoking, I reached this decision that it was time to knock the drinking on the head. So it seemed like an obvious choice to use the same method. And you can call it cognitive realignment if you want to call it something fancy, but it's really just changing what you believe about the behavior. It's about changing the thought process as well. And that's what I do with people. We get to grips with what they believe about alcohol because we all have beliefs about it, largely formed from places like James Bond and sporting events and things like that. We believe that alcohol makes us sophisticated, that it makes us strong, that it makes us popular and good looking and things like that. And that's what I got to grips with. I started to realize that what I believed about alcohol was A, not true, and B, was not helping me. It wasn't serving me. It wasn't getting me any closer to the thing that was most important to me at the time, which was starting a family.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like cognitive behavioral therapy, where you focus on your thoughts and your beliefs and change
Yeah,
those.
absolutely, absolutely. So cognitive realignment is it's a branch of cognitive behavioral therapy, though I don't tend to talk about CBT that much because the bit of CBT that tends to get used for helping people to stop drinking and to stop smoking, I don't think is particularly effective. I mean, if it's helped you to stop smoking and drinking, then I will absolutely defer to your right to say it's really, really effective. But I don't like some of the suggestions that they make around triggers. But the cognitive realignment bit sits within CBT. So yeah.
Okay. In general, how do you think drinking too much would affect somebody's parenting?
So I think there's really there's so many things here, and to reduce it to its absolutely most simple elements, if you think about the main effect alcohol has on people, is it robs you of your energy and it robs you of your
Mm,
focus. Now I can go into the mechanisms of all of that, but trust me, those are the two things that it does. It makes you feel tired all of the time, and it stops you being able to pay attention to things that are important. And if you get down to brass tacks, most things, and parenting in particular, what do you need to be a good parent? You need energy and you need focus because that's all presence really is.
mm,
Being in the moment, and that's what children want more than anything else, is they want your attention, they want your presence, they want your focus. And if you've got a bit of energy to kick the ball around the park, then that's all happy days, isn't it? So I think on that level, to put it very, very simply, it does make everything you want to do with your kids much, much harder. But I think there's also a more kind of fundamental point that I'm a big fan of the work of Brené Brown. I'm sure you're familiar with her. I'm sure your listeners are as well. I think it's probably ought to be illegal not to like her stuff. But she said you can't give your kids what you don't have, and I know that that's true because my daughter is always asking for a unicorn, and I can't give her one because I haven't got one. But I think on a more kind of serious note, if you don't have a good relationship with alcohol, then you can't give that to your children. And
mm,
one thing that I've met from all of the parents that I've worked with is they don't want their children to drink.
mm,
And unless you have a healthy relationship with alcohol, then your children are very, very unlikely to have a healthy relationship with alcohol. And that, I think, is something that worries parents even more. So I was working with a guy a while back, and he said that his main motivation for stopping drinking was because his son, who I think was 6 or 7 at the time, said to him, Daddy, when I grow up, do I have to drink?
Oh.
And it's just like, that's crushing, that, I mean, from one point of view, it's a great motivator. And yeah, he successfully stopped drinking. But it's not the kind of thing that you want to hear.
And I completely agree with what you said about your children just want you to be present. I've definitely noticed that from a chronic pain and chronic illness perspective. Like there are a lot of things I can't do with my daughter, but I modify the things that I can do. So if she wants to play Barbies, I can't sit on the floor with her and play Barbies, but I can lay on her bed and do the voices while she
Yeah,
moves them all around.
yeah. And did you know what? That is so much. Yeah, that's going to help us so much more than somebody who you know can sit on the floor but doesn't because they're always on their blinking phone.
That's true. And I'm not a big drinker. My husband and I probably drink 3 or 4 times a year. I mean, we've got quite a bit of alcohol, but it's been there for years because we don't really drink it. And I
That's a
haven't
good
really,
sign.
yeah, I haven't really thought about the legacy that we're leaving with our daughter regarding our relationship to alcohol. So I think that's a really good point that your children are going to look at you and decide what they're going to do. I was adopted, so I've got a birth mom, and she drinks a lot. And my half brother, her son, doesn't really party. I mean, he's 22 and he doesn't really do much of that. And I wonder if that's because he sees how much his mom drinks.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've met a huge number of children of alcoholic parents, and they almost split down the middle. Half of them
Mm.
become very, very serious drinkers, and half of them become completely teetotal. And some of the I've met some people who don't drink but have quite an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, even though they don't drink it. And I think that, that's obviously preferable to having an unhealthy relationship with it and drinking it. But you can still see the legacy, even though it's not physical.
Right. And I just think that's such an important point because I always think about what legacy I'm leaving my daughter as far as being a mom. And I've just never thought about other aspects of our life, like, for instance, alcohol. So I think that's a great point.
Yeah, I mean, the only piece of parenting advice that I've ever had that I really think was worth paying attention to was my good friend Liz said, "Your kids will ignore everything that you say, and they will copy everything that you do."
Yeah, that seems to be true sometimes. So we've talked a little bit about chronic pain. I know you've done a lot of research. I know you're not a chronic pain expert, which is fine. Um, but I've known several people who have used alcohol or even illegal drugs to help deal with and manage their physical pain. What has your research kind of shown you about that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the things that really interested me about the research. One of the things that kind of surprised us. So we did some research into the main reason why people thought they drank in the past. So these were all with people who had got sober and therefore had had some time to reflect on why they had started drinking. And unsurprisingly, a very big uh, bucket kind of was unprocessed childhood trauma. That's very much
Mm-hmm.
connected with alcohol, any kind of drug addiction, any kind of um, self-sabotaging behavior. Even it is always connected with childhood trauma. So there was a big group of people who that was true for. There was another group of people which were maybe more surprising, where they weren't talking about any particular traumatic event. They were talking more in terms of, it was part of the culture and therefore they did it to fit in. And that was how it started. And, it was just repeated exposure that did it for them. There's some people who talked about social anxiety, feeling uncomfortable in social situations. And that was how they started drinking. So there was a group which was kind of a bit harder to kind of sum up completely. And then the third group were all around trauma that had happened in their adult life. And this is people who were drinking at a relatively normal level until something happened, and that was what
Mm.
sparked an increase in their drinking. And the usual suspects come up with that. You get a lot of divorce, you get a lot of unemployment, business failure, those kind of things. You get bits around grief as well. But one of the things that came up was around accidents. So car accidents, accidents at works, and things like that. And some of them specifically mentioned that they had, their drinking had really increased to sort of self-medicate the chronic pain. But some of them just mentioned that it was as a result of an accident. And for a while, I just thought, well, that is the mental trauma that comes from the accident. But I wonder how much it's tied up actually with processing the chronic pain and numbing it, because alcohol, at the end of the day, does have a anesthetic sedatory kind of effect. In fact, before chloroform was pioneered as a medical practice, if you were going to have any kind of serious medical surgery, alcohol was the anesthetic of choice.
That's really interesting. And I know that there's frequently a correlation between childhood trauma or even adult trauma and physical pain, physical chronic pain. So it might be all interconnected, that people are using alcohol to numb their physical pain, but also to numb their emotional pain.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And a strong aspect that comes up in the research that we've done into what keeps people sober is this kind of embodiment piece around reconnecting with your body and actually feeling things. And that's something that's so common among drinkers. Part of what they want to
Mm.
do is they want to no longer feel things. And whether that starts off physically or mentally, it doesn't really matter. It ends up, you can't selectively numb. You end up numbing it all, don't you? So if you start off from a very um, from more of a psychological place, you end up still numbing all of the physical stuff, and then of course when you're not drinking, that leads to a lot of discomfort, and that becomes a bit of a cycle in and of itself. But of course, you can absolutely do it from the other direction. You can have genuine physical pain, and if it's not treated, if you're not able to access medical care, or the medical care you receive is unsatisfactory, then you end up, you reach for what you can get, don't you? But of course, by trying to dampen that physical pain, you also end up dampening all of the emotional feelings, which is it has a huge knock-on effect for relationships, for the enjoyment of life, for parenting.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how when you numb your feelings and you don't feel anything, how that would affect your relationships with other people, especially the people that are closest to you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the real sadnesses around alcohol use. And honestly, you don't actually have to drink that much of it. What a lot of people would consider to be moderate drinking, so 2 or 3 drinks 3 or 4 times a week, is enough to really mess up the balance of your brain chemistry. So what happens when you have that drink is you get a spike in certain neurotransmitters. In particular, GABA is a very important one. That's one that's connected with anxiety. So you get a spike in this neurotransmitter, so you feel more relaxed. But of course, your brain doesn't really like that. What your brain wants is balance. It doesn't want these kind of like huge spikes. So it then releases a load of things that kind of pull that back, to kind of try and regain that balance. And that's just what happens if you do it once or twice. But if you keep doing it, your brain wises up. So it stops releasing these massive amounts of neurotransmitters when you drink alcohol. But again, the problem is you can't do these things selectively. It actually reduces the release of those neurotransmitters whatever you're doing, whether it's alcohol, whether it's interacting with your family, whether it's watching a great film, whether it's skating. I don't know, probably you're not as into inline skating as I am, but whatever you're doing, it stops the release of these neurotransmitters. So you end up just not being able to produce as much of these transmitters like GABA, which means you end up feeling anxious all of the time. Your ability to learn is compromised. Your ability to actually make connections and to build meaningful relationships is hampered on a very kind of like biological, neurological level.
I think that's so interesting how the brain works because a lot of people, myself included, when I do drink, it's because of anxiety or social anxiety specifically, um, or because I want to relax. So I want my, my brain to produce that GABA and all that stuff. But I think it's interesting how you say that the brain is counteracting that if you're drinking too much, and it's doing the exact opposite of what I want it to do.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the thing is, you can argue over the amount of time it takes your body to process alcohol, what that really, really means. But I, you can the most advanced test will detect alcohol in your system 5 days after you've drunk it. So it's kicking around for the best part of a week. So even if you're only drinking once a week, it's still never really sober. You've always got some
Mhm.
alcohol in your system, and I think that's what people don't realize is that actually what a lot of people consider to be moderate drinking is it does have quite an impact on people. And if you're drinking infrequently, then it's really not going to be having too much of an effect on you. I mean, it will have an effect. There is always a risk to these things, but if you're drinking every month or 3 or 4 times a year, then it's really not going to be doing too much with you. But as soon as you start getting into that kind of weekly sort of basis, particularly drinking to intoxication, which is something that
Mm.
36% of Americans and 40% of Brits do at least monthly, that's
Wow.
where you start to get the damage. That's where you start to get these ill effects, where you start to run the risk of the long-term problems.
And I've always hated drinking to intoxication because that does not feel good. And it certainly doesn't feel good when you're recovering from it. So it's something I don't really fully understand. Like, why do you want to drink too much? Like, I get drinking to calm yourself down, to relax, to numb something. But getting to that feeling is just more than I really care to do.
Well, I think it's one of the ironies of alcohol, I suppose, that it is an intoxicant. So therefore, you could argue that its purpose is to intoxicate you. But that is where the danger really lies. You will do damage to your body by drinking to intoxication. So it's like basically, if you use it the way it is intended to be used, it is dangerous. And actually, if you look at the effects of drinking 2, 3 drinks, well, there have been a lot of studies done where they've divided up the group of participants. They've given half of them orange juice, they've given half of them vodka and orange, and they've asked them every 15 minutes to record how they feel, because nothing gets a party going like recording how you feel every 15
Yeah.
minutes. Yeah. But what they found was that the effects of alcohol are not actually noticeable until you get to that third or fourth drink. The placebo effect accounts for all of the positive effects up to about the third drink. So it is only when you notice it that it actually gets dangerous. And what you actually enjoy most of the time when you're drinking, it's because you're with friends. It's because you're out somewhere nice. It's because you finished work for the day. That's what you enjoy, not the alcohol.
That's interesting because basically you're saying, because I usually only drink one drink unless it's like a holiday party or something, then I'll have a couple glasses of wine. But um, I guess I really, yeah, I normally don't notice it, but part of it, I guess, is mental. Like, oh, I'm drinking a glass of wine, I should feel more relaxed, right?
Yeah, 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 absolutely. I mean that is literally the placebo effect. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sure your listeners are all more than well aware that if you give people a sugar pill and tell them it's a paracetamol, it will cure their headache. And likewise, if you give people a paracetamol and tell them it's a sugar pill, it won't.
Yeah, the placebo effect is fascinating.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that is actually quite well understood, but nobody talks about it in terms of alcohol. And I mean, along that great big list of stuff that we don't talk about
Yeah.
alcohol, we're more than happy to have a laugh and a joke about how it's wine o'clock and how you're acting funny because you've been drinking, but nobody really wants to get into the actual effects that it has on you and whether it is indeed worth drinking or not.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too, because we don't a lot of people just don't want to, it's part of society. It's part of our culture. It's part of having fun sometimes and being out with friends and having parties. So if
Yeah.
we were actually to talk about that stuff, then
Yeah. Do you know who the I think it was the study was done between 2010 and 2020. They looked at the people who'd spent the most on Super Bowl adverts, and the number one spend was by Bud Light, and the number three spend was by Bud. And it was just like it's like it might be a little bit of a connection between American culture and alcohol. I don't know. I'm just saying. But the irony, of course, is who was the greatest footballer between 2010 and 2020? It was Tom Brady. And
Tom
I know Tom
Brady.
Brady is a bit of a wedge issue. You either love him or you hate him, but you've got to acknowledge he's got more Super Bowl rings than anybody else, and he doesn't drink. He's used to advertise alcohol, but he doesn't drink. So all
Wow.
of his success, all of his strength, all of his abilities, all of his I'm not going to say charisma, but all of his positive qualities are being hijacked by the drinks industry. But to attain that elite level of success, he's avoiding alcohol.
I didn't know that. And I know Taylor Swift, when she started her Eras tour, she said she stopped drinking because she needed to be able to have that energy and that focus that you were talking about to be able to do all those dance moves and actually be able to do a great performance.
Yeah, I've never been to a Taylor Swift concert, but I did meet a Katy Perry impersonator who also does Taylor Swift, and she worked really, really hard that evening. And dancing is it's very, very physical, and singing whilst you're doing it makes it even more so. So if you want to perform at the top of your ability, whatever field it is, whether it's business, whether it's entertainment, whether it's sport, whether it's writing, whatever it is, if you really want to maximize your ability, then don't pour an poison down your throat.
Mm.
It's kind of fairly obvious.
So is your position that generally people should be completely sober and avoid alcohol, or that like once a month is healthy and okay? Like what do you think?
Well, I mean, honestly, I've never met anybody who stopped drinking who regrets it. So that does make me strongly suspect that most people would be better off without drinking. That said, I am also a realist, and I'm also quite well aware of the statistics. There is a group of people, probably around 25 to 30% of people that drink alcohol at what I would agree is a low risk level. I'm never going to say there's going to be no risk to it, because there always will be a risk through putting a known carcinogen into your body, and so but they drink at a relatively safe level, and they don't have too many problems with them. But that is actually quite a small segment of the population. It's probably around 25 to 30% of the people. Around 20% of the people don't drink at all, and everybody else, their drinking is questionable. At least I would say at least 40% of people need to really seriously reconsider their drinking, and whether that's abstinence or whether that's moderation, I think there's room for both, and we do a lot of work with people to help them to get back to that safe kind of level. We tend to talk a lot about things like mindfulness. So that's actually being aware of what you're drinking. Most people drink in a very automatic way. They drink the first one because it's Friday. They like literally give it no more thought than it is Friday. I'll have a drink, and then they are on a bit of a yeah, they're on a bit of a spiral, and they definitely don't think about all of the other ones, because that's the first thing alcohol does, is it impairs your prefrontal cortex's ability to make decisions. So there's a lot of automatic drinking that goes on. So the first thing I think that people can do is to actually become aware. And a great way of doing that is to increase the amount of novelty in your drinking. So instead of just drinking what you normally drink, when you sit down at a restaurant, actually look at the drinks menu. Think, have they got a cocktail that I like the sound of? Have they got a beer that I've never tried? Have they got a different kind of wine? Why don't I try that? If you normally drink wine, have a beer, mix it up a little bit and actually become more aware of it. Not only do you tend to drink less, you also tend to enjoy it more. So that's mindfulness. We also talk a lot about bright lines, which are having very clear limits. I don't tend to be a fan of tracking the amount of units that you drink, because it's just too complicated. So I would say to people, if you're going to drink, I ideally only drink one drink, but definitely don't ever drink more than two. And if you're going to say, I'll only drink on the weekend, that's not a bad strategy. Though, of course, you get invited to a wedding on a Wednesday, or your birthday's on a Tuesday, so you've got to be a little bit flexible with it. So maybe say, yeah, I'm only going to drink twice a week, rather than I'm only going to drink on the weekends. But yeah, I mean, there's so many things that you can do to have an effect on your consumption. And there's so many great alcohol-free options out there now. Those are increasing massively. It's something that I've noticed since I've stopped drinking. When I stopped drinking, it was like, well, you're not drinking, have a Coke, and that was about it. But now there's some great alcohol-free beers. So what we say a lot of the time is, well, why don't you just start, have an alcohol-free beer? Have the first two alcohol-free, and if you still want another drink after that, have one with alcohol in it. Rather than doing it the other way round, or just mix it up, do one for one. There's a lot of ways that you can reduce the effect that the alcohol is going to have on you, and that's really, what I want. I don't expect to ever get to a point where the world is completely free of alcohol. I mean, that would be a terrible idea. How would you clean your hands? You've got to have the hand gel, haven't you? That's what alcohol is really for. So we don't want a world totally devoid of alcohol, but we want a world devoid of the harm that is done by alcohol.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, that alcohol can definitely do us harm. And I think that back to the placebo effect, and drinking a non-alcoholic one with an alcoholic one, or before the alcoholic ones, placebo effect, in play, you're still going to feel relaxed and good, and because you think that it's beer. So it sounds like you do a lot of really good work with people. So if people want to find you and work with you, where could they find you?
So if you like reading my latest book, it's called Real Men Quit. That's on Amazon. If you like James Bond, and you like, there's a bit of Tom Brady in there, but other sports people get mentioned as well. So there's quite a bit of sport. There's quite a bit of film. It's hopefully a fairly light-hearted take on a serious subject. That's called Real Men Quit. That's on Amazon. If you want to check out one of my other books, Get Over Indulgence, your listeners can grab a free copy of that. All they'd need to do is pop getover.uk into the internet. That'll take you to a bit of my website where you can download the PDF Kindle version if you want to read it, or if you can stand to listen to me for 2 hours and 45 minutes, then you can get the audio version there as well. That's getover.uk. Like I say, it takes you to a bit of my website. There's links to all the socials there. I'm pretty busy on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, all of the usual suspects. And if you can spell Bhaskaran Brown, I am pretty easy to find, but most people can't even pronounce it. So, yes.
That's okay. I'll have all those links in the show notes. So if anybody wants to get to your website or to your book or to your social media, it'll all be there. I'll
Thank
find
you.
you. All right. Well, thank you for coming on. It's been an interesting conversation.
It's been my pleasure. It's been really, really interesting.
So make sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any health, parenting, or life advice. For my freebie 30 ways to relieve pain without taking a pill, go to ithurtstomom.com/tips. If you have comments, suggestions, or want to be on this podcast, email me at ithurtstomom@gmail.com. I wish everybody a blessed and pain-free day.